Thank you.
Mic working okay? Okay, great. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to give a quick introduction. DemystData is a provider of online data and predictive analytics solutions for the financial services industry. Their mission is to unlock global financial services by providing actionable access to high-quality customer information. So that sets the tone, but I'm going to ask you first, because people always are interested, how does an entrepreneur from Melbourne, Australia, end up in Hong Kong, and then you did a stint in Shenzhen as well, right? And then now based in New York. Would love to hear your background on how.
Wow. Okay. Well, I moved to the US originally with a previous technology business that was doing analytics with insurers. That became part of a business, LexisNexis. And I was doing that for a little while, and through that noticed the abundance of data that are available now. As an Australian from Melbourne moving to the US, I got declined for credit cards because of my thin file status. In fact, I still get declined for credit cards. And while working at a supposedly big data shop like LexisNexis, it became apparent that there's a bit of a disconnect. If there's all of this great data about me, about customers, whether it's online in social media, in telcos, in banks, in insurers, why is it so many customers that are actually very, very strong credit profiles are being incorrectly declined? So it was that seed of an idea, particularly in markets like China, Indonesia, Brazil, that led me to scratch my head and ask the question, well, there's a bit of a disconnect here. There's supposedly this supply of data, but it's not making its way into the decisioning engines of the big banks and the emerging lenders that are out there. So that was the genesis of how I ended up in New York. I then left that business to found DemystData 4.5 years ago or so now, moved to Hong Kong, which was close to a lot of the emerging markets which had a lack of existing data infrastructure and had booming emerging credit segments, and started to work with banks and lenders to really figure out from first principles what are the best data sets that can help confirm that people are credit-worthy customers, real customers, and use that technology angle as a way to solve this question of, as you said earlier, unlocking access to financial services.
So when you started out, was it mainly focused on emerging markets and solving a problem there? And since then, how have you grown over the last 4 years? How's it evolved?
Yeah, that was the initial idea and approach, was to work in emerging markets. One of the things we found was that although emerging markets may have a bigger long-term opportunity for us, it was much, much easier for us as a startup to get pilots and tests off the ground here in the US. So ironically, I found myself back and forth here to the US very, very frequently, working with big banks and lenders here in the US. Through that, built a team here in New York, still had the presence in Hong Kong, working with lenders through Asia. And that was how I ended up in a business that had a New York and Hong Kong presence. The other thing we found, which is just touching on the last speaker, was that it was quite challenging to build a venture-backed tech business based in Hong Kong. More recently, there have been a lot of new venture funds popping up in Hong Kong, but back then, 4 or 5 years ago, it was still reasonably new. So we found we had to move here to find the right capital.
That seed investment is fine, but when you get to a stage where you're looking to raise more capital, it becomes a little constricting, I'm understanding.
That's right.
In that market.
That's
Great. Right. So backtrack, because I'm not a big data expert, which makes me the perfect person to ask you this. We hear that as a buzzword all the time, like, in the media, and most recently in the past year or two. What is big data as it relates to what your company specifically does? Like, who are your clients? What do you do with the data? And, what kind of services are you providing specifically, or what problems are you solving?
Yeah, the word big data may be new,
but it's such a buzzword. It's just all encompassing.
It's the same thing that's been around for 50 years in every aspect of predictive modeling and technology, around taking lots of input attributes about a person or a small business and making some assessment about them to predict that they're a good customer for a financial institution. In our context, what that means is not that different to the fundamentals of financial services, again, as of 50 or even 100 years ago, which is, how does an institution get comfortable that Christine is a real person, Christine has a job, Christine's income exceeds her expenses, Christine's good for a loan. What's interesting is that the data about you in China, in Indonesia, in Brazil, if you're a new immigrant here in the US, the data that you generate today is living in an entirely different industry and set of areas than the banking sector. So the traditional mechanism of contributory credit bureaus sharing data with each other existed in a world where data was scarce. And data's not scarce anymore. Data's abundant. We saw some photos earlier of people on their smartphones 24/7 generating data. And the good ones generate even more data about who they are, and that data can be used in a whole range of areas. So back to your question about what do we specifically do, it's answering questions like I just described, helping verify that people are real, that they have jobs, that their income is as they self-reported, that they aren't exhibiting suspicious behavior from a fraud perspective. And our clients use that as part of a real-time transaction to be able to say, in certain countries around the world, yes, we are going to open an account with this person, lend to this person, strike insurance policies with this person. Industries where data is important because there's some element of counterparty risk because they want to look into the whites of the eyes of the customer.
What I'm understanding is, does it actually, it makes the whole process more efficient, or does it speed up the process of approval for these companies when they're looking at potential clients to approve? Is that what it's doing, shortening that window, or just kind of creating, like what specific problem has it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in emerging markets, sometimes as much as 90-95% of credit applications are still manual in some way. There's phone calls being made. In the US, that's still a significant number. It's down to something like 20% these days. So one big area of activity is taking that manual lookup and just skipping it with confidence based on the data that's available. So some of our clients in Indonesia, the current process for identity verification is you apply for a loan and they immediately get a guy on a moped to go and come around to your house and then go to your place of work and take some photos, and that's the process for applying for a small business loan.
Right? Yeah, that's interesting.
But for a big chunk of those applicants, you can just skip that process and have a real-time decision. So that's one area of usage. The other area of usage is the absence of data about the best customers just leaves banks to say no to everyone. So adding in data means you can accept more at the same level of risk.
Got it. So we only have probably a minute or two left. Sure. From a company, running a company from a cross-border perspective, on a broader macro scale, because I know people in the audience have this experience, what are your challenges of doing so in scaling? When you're at the point now, you started in Hong Kong, but you're obviously here in New York now. There's some words.
Yeah, we're now working with 4 of the world's top 10 banks and quite a few of the emerging peer-to-peer lenders, and they are in, not only are they in multiple countries, but they're taking us across border as well, because that's where the technology adds the most value. We've got a team here in New York, one in Hong Kong and one in London, and it's quite a big challenge for us internally to coordinate activities. The technology itself is increasingly reusable across those geographies, so we get to leverage the scale that we get from being in multiple markets, but the internal challenges of doing that are quite significant. Furthermore, the client types are very, very different, whether you're dealing with a microfinance lender in China versus an extremely sophisticated peer-to-peer lender here in the US. So we just build subject matter expertise around different verticals.
That's great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Mark. Let's give them a round of applause.